You're way past ready. So, all right, we'll start off with some stuff. All right, here's the stuff. Thing number one. If you were going to turn something in, say, a month late, which I'm not saying that one of you did, but at least one of you did this week, turn in the first quiz. One of you turned in the first quiz. Yes, that's what I'm saying. I need to know why you are turning in a quiz a month late. You can't just do that and not tell me why. Now, don't tell me why in front of everybody here in class, but send me an email that explains this, because I got to know stuff like that. Now, if you're a day late, 30 minutes late, couple days late, I don't care. You know, if it's in there when I'm doing the grading, we're good. But if you're more than a day or two late, I really do need an explanation. I do, okay? Would your high school teachers take something a month late without an explanation? No. Do you think your college? No, your college professor's not cool about that either. So, and especially if you're a month late and your grade is substantially higher on the quiz than other people's. So it makes me a little nervous about you. So sorry, I'm not naming names or anything, but if that's you, I got to know what's going on, okay? Not during class, send me an email. All right. Thing number two, I got an email today from somebody's high school coordinator, not yours, but somebody else's. It says that they think that it's a problem that I don't have a regular office hour on Friday. So I will explain to you why I don't have a regular office hour on Friday. It'll be fast. You're not coming. That's it. That's it. Plus, I assume you have other classes on Friday. That's what I assume. You have things to do. I do have just kind of that general, anytime you want to meet, let me know, and we'll have an office hour thing. But if not having an office hour is a problem for you, I will make a regular one. I have a feeling I'm about to anyway, because this high school coordinator thinks I should sit here for an hour staring at a computer screen while no one logs on. But I guess if I do, I'll just grade while no one logs on. It'll be okay. But if you ever need to meet about anything, let me know. We'll set up a time. You know, as long as you don't have class and I don't have class, we're cool. For me, it's Tuesday, Thursday classes. So, all right. Thing number three, don't cheat. I'm gonna go with that. I was grading we're really mostly yesterday. I didn't grade over the weekend. Gosh, soccer. But I was grading yesterday, and there were a couple people whose answers were not only exactly the same, but they were exactly the same as an online resource. So that's like 0 for 2 there. That's not good. So we can't do that. If you did that, don't do that again. I wrote a note in there that says, hey, your answer looks exactly like this, and put the link to where your answer is. Now you can email me back and say, no, that's not where I copied it from, but you copied it from somewhere. Don't do that anymore, okay? Don't do that. You can get an F for the entire class for that. I'm trying to be nice about this stuff. Don't do it, okay? Put in your own words. Yeah, don't copy from cheapanswers.com or wherever you got the answer. Okay. And let's see. Tell me why you turn in stuff late. Oh, also, I got a couple of emails over the weekend, and I got one really late on Friday. I was, you know, where I was, soccer. It started Friday night, saying like, I really don't understand what you're asking for the weekly question. Can you explain it to me? I was like, no, maybe. No, I mean, I'll try, but it made me think not everybody pays attention during class. Now, I get why you're not paying attention. I know some of you are shocked by that. I get why you're not paying attention all the time because you're zoomed out. I get it. Yeah, me too. I get it. But I usually at some point, the first 10, 15 minutes of class, go over the weekly question. So you need to review the weekly question. If you look at the recording, like first 10 or 15 minutes, that's probably where it is. I'm just saying, just saying. And I'm not trying to be distressed that you don't pay attention during class, because believe me, I get it. But if I'm going over it during class and there's a recording, that's a good place to look. Okay. All right, I think that's it for now. I may think of some other stuff I want to be cranking out here in a minute. We'll see. Probably not. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to open the wrong thing. I also wanted to mention, let's see. Let me open the right thing. Sorry. You know, I'm probably like you as well. No one really is concerned about me at all, like wants to talk to me, any of that kind of stuff until I start class. So my phone has been going off constantly since class started. Isn't that the weirdest thing? Yeah. All right. Let's see. Let me see what I have open. Crud. I know this is probably why that guy thought I was the worst professor ever, right? Okay, we have notes. We have weekly questions and comments. I definitely don't want to show you that. Oh, weekly question review. Let's look at that. I'm not sure if you're all aware that there's a review for your quiz. So the timed question review, I think it might say Unit 2 quiz review or something, is in the course documents page. And I just want to show you what it looks like, just in case you hadn't noticed. Looks like this. So yours is a little dotted list of stuff that I might potentially ask a question about on the quiz. So if you look over that stuff, I think it will help you as you study for the quiz. We do have a quiz scheduled for this week. It'll open tomorrow, midnight, like 12:01. I always suggest that you wait until after the last class to take it. So I wouldn't take it till after class on Thursday. I don't mean immediately after class, but you know what I mean, because we're going to go over some more stuff. And it'll stay open until Friday at midnight. Well, it stays open beyond that, clearly, because I just said somebody took one about a month late. So, but if it's that late, it doesn't automatically grade it. It gives me the option, which is why if you're that person, I haven't graded it yet. It's like, I got to find out what's going on first. All right. So here's all the stuff that you might want to study. And we'll talk about a lot of this stuff today during class. We've already talked about some of it. And then there's the big list for next time. Woohoo. And let's see, weekly question 1301. Okay. Try again. Let me check the chat, sorry. Oh, okay. Same chat about the sick person. I'm sorry for them. I truly am. Okay. Serna, it's my first day doing a Zoom class, apparently. Dang it, where'd the weekly questions go? Poop. Can I say poop? Are you okay with that? Dang, I don't understand where it went.
I'm okay with that.
Thank you.
You can say poop.
Thanks. I promise you it was open. Where on Blackboard? They're on, what is that thing where you put videos? YouTube. YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there's a YouTube page. There should be an announcement early in the class that explains where the recordings are. Should be. And I can resend that, you know, I can do that. Every time I open the one that says weekly questions, it opens to timed review. I think my computer is having a problem. I think that's what's going on. Because this time it opened, I don't want to say poop again. That's twice in class. All right, 1301 Unit 2 weekly questions. That looks promising. Oh no, that's the you don't want to see that one. That's the one where I write my comments. I don't want you to see all my comments. I save them so I remember what I said. But I scrolled up so you can't see the comments. So our weekly question for this week, some more poop right there, is how did the framers of the Constitution balance the competing claims of local self-government, sectional interest, and national authority? So you're working on that question, which I assume you are, because ideally that one's due on Friday. You would want to look at, let me find some page numbers for you, perhaps, because the book's super specific about this stuff, and it's why I ask these questions and tell you to look at the book, because the book will have the little headings that say stuff that's really helpful. So for this section, or for this question, let's see, slavery revolution, that's the wrong chapter. Here we go. So if you look at pages 260, start at 263, and then you go through about 266. It talks pretty specifically about balancing claims of local self-government, sectional interest, and national authority. So we're talking, sorry, I'm going to sneeze at you, 262 to 266. That'll be good. Right in there, 262 to 266. And we're going to talk about it, I promise. I'm not saying we won't, but all right, I got to figure out how to close this without scrolling down any, don't I? I don't want to cause trouble. My goodness. No wonder that guy said I was a terrible professor. All right, let's look at the notes.
Not a terrible professor.
I know it. It's the worst.
Sorry about my dogs.
That's all right. The dogs get excited. So, all right. I'm just hoping my neighbor's dog doesn't hear and chime in. So, all right. So here we are thinking about, crud, what is all this stuff? Oh, it's chapter 8. It's like, because I was thinking we have the list of stuff. All right. So under the Articles of Confederation, we already talked about that. Loose league of friendship. People had more loyalty to their state. Each state had an equal vote in the Continental Congress, Confederation Congress, and no executive branch, no judicial branch, just one branch of government. And the goal was to create a weak government, and they were very successful at that. They had trouble with anything that had to do with money and the military, and those two are pretty well tied together because you can't have a free military because people like to get paid and you have to pay for stuff. So there you go. And if you lived in the South and the North needed something and they said, hey, will you send troops? You probably said nope. And if they lived in the North and you lived in the South and you needed something and you asked for troops, they'd probably say nope. So most decisions had to be either 2/3 or unanimous. So it was really hard to get a lot of stuff done. That was by design. They did get some stuff done though. We successfully completed the American Revolution, woohoo, independence. And there were some land ordinances that the book mentions, specifically the land ordinance of 1785, plus the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which, importantly enough, banned slavery from it's essentially the Ohio Valley region, that part of the country right beneath, right south, can I say that? Directly south of the Great Lakes. It's where they grow corn. You know what I'm saying. Okay, there's a lot of places in the United States where they grow corn. But they also set up townships and rules about how many people had to live in certain places before they could apply for territorial status and then statehood. So they do some useful things under the Articles of Confederation, but then Shays' Rebellion breaks out. And we talked about that last time, the Daniel Shays Fellow, important Revolutionary War veterans. He's getting his land foreclosed on, his farm foreclosed on. Not excited about that. Raises a small army, rebels against the foreclosure courts. And then the people in the state of Massachusetts say, hey, this is a problem because if people don't like the laws, then they just raise small armies and fight against the law. So the state hired a private army to put down the rebellion. About 1,000 people get arrested. Some people within the federal government say this could be problematic. So they say we should have constitutional convention. The one guy who doesn't think it's a problem, Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson says, stuff happens from time to time. Don't worry about it. Only said it in a nice Jeffersonian sort of way. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. So sometimes people rise up. If they win, they were right. If they lose, they were clearly wrong. Importance of Shays' Rebellion is that it causes most founding fathers, the ones who are not Thomas Jefferson, think that the Articles of Confederation are not strong enough. You have the meeting at Annapolis in Maryland in September 1786. September, maybe it's a little later, but I think it was September. And then they say, hey, let's meet again. Not very many states show up, only 6. And they say, hey, let's try this again, but in May when the weather's better, 1787, and we'll meet in the middle in Philadelphia. So they did, and everybody but Rhode Island shows up, and then they have the conference. The book also mentioned that a lot of cool people go to the conference, some famous dudes, that they are on the average much more educated, much wealthier, and much more likely to have served in the military. So these are guys who were really invested in the American Revolution and participated in some way, either through negotiation or in the military. All right. And there were lots of compromises in the writing of the Constitution. And I think we talked about this last time. James Madison, who's like a little studious dude, spent about 6 months looking at the constitutions of every constitutional republic that was created before this time and said, here are things that worked, here are things that didn't work. He thought that you could. There were people like, oh, what was that guy's name? The Baron de Montesquieu. He wrote that, I'm trying to think what the name of his thing was. I think it's just called was it called On Democracy? I can't remember what it was called. Why can't I think of this? But he wrote that you couldn't have a representative government, a Republican democracy, where you vote for people who represent you in a very large place. But Madison thought that you could, as long as you varied the type of representation. And this is where we get into some of the stuff that helps you answer this week's question. Constitutional compromises. Madison came in with the Virginia plan, the 2-house legislature, upper and lower house. They had different types of decisions they would make, but both houses would show representation by population. So it'd be proportional. The New Jersey plan didn't like that. The person who, well, I don't know if a plan, we should personify a plan, but it favored an equal representation and a 1-house legislature. The compromise was 2 houses, 1 proportional, 1 equal. And that's, of course, what we decided to stick with. They talk about slavery a lot in the Constitution without ever saying the word slavery, and the book talks about how even the use of the term slavery would denigrate the document, which is probably pretty fascinating since they didn't think the institution itself denigrated the Union. However, we know that they did understand that slavery and liberty didn't go together, and that's why they talked about it so much. Their thought seems to be that they'll work with it. They'll allow slavery to continue at this point with the idea that as they moved forward, that slavery would be eliminated. And their thought was probably not in their generation, but the next generation of political leaders would take care of that. As we know from our study of history, they were very much incorrect about that. They do agree that they will end the slave trade 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution, and that does happen during Jefferson's presidency. They also agree that they'll add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution after it's ratified, which they do as well. I think we're used to politicians maybe making promises and then forgetting them once it's time to fulfill them. In this instance about the Constitution, they were good about following through on those things. Ending the slave trade, as we already mentioned, doesn't mean ending slavery. It means ending the foreign importation of slaves, which was mostly accomplished, but not super well enforced. And there were deals that were made to allow that to happen about where bills regulating commerce would start, and those would need to start in the House rather than in the Senate. That gives an advantage to the North. Leaving the slave trade for 20 years gives an advantage to the South. The Three-Fifths Compromise, I know you're more familiar with, allowed counting 60% of slaves in the South for purposes of population and representation in the House. That also gives you more votes in the Electoral College, which is where we're headed next. They also created an Electoral College, which officially elects the president. The president's elected by popular vote, kind of, sort of, and the Electoral College really. Electors are chosen by each state, and you get one for each senator and one for each person in the House of Representatives. So each state is guaranteed at least 3 electors, and larger states get more. So this ensures that even states like Alaska, where nobody lives, still have at least 3 votes in the Electoral College. If we went strictly by population, they certainly weren't worried about Alaska back then, of course, but there would be certain states where very few people lived that really wouldn't have any meaningful voice in the election. And I know there's always some discussion of getting rid of the Electoral College. And I know that was one of the things that my more Republican friends were saying, if Biden gets elected, he'll get rid of the Electoral College. He really can't, because it's part of the Constitution. So you would have to have a constitutional amendment. And there are ways that the Congress can get rid of that. Our constitutional convention, the Congress can create an amendment and then send it to the states. I wouldn't ever look for that to pass because Iowa still wants to be important, and Alaska would like to matter. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so small states are never going to go for that, and there's more small states than large states, and I'm talking population. All right, and typically most states in the modern era have rules that bind the electors to vote the same way their state does. There are some states where they can be independent. During this time period, all of that, of course, was left up to the states. It still is, which leads us to the discussion of separation of powers and federalism. Now, your book, I know I've already mentioned this, but your book is super, super specific about this. So if you look on page 265, it reminds you of what these things are. Federalism is the idea of shared powers at the state level and the federal level. So, for example, there's certain things that the states regulate, like, I don't know, speed limit, drinking age, public education, that sort of stuff. And there's certain things that the federal government regulates, like immigration policy, borders, that sort of thing. So there's certain powers at one level and certain powers at another. And at times, the states are supposed to share these powers. You may or may not have seen some of this going quite well and some of this not going quite so well in the modern era. One of those instances has been vaccine production and distribution for the COVID vaccine. So the federal government took on the obligation of creating a vaccine, and they were going to distribute it to the states, and then the states were going to distribute it however they saw fit. You saw this in the earlier in the crisis, where the federal government was going to distribute PPE, personal protective equipment, and let the states distribute that as they saw fit. And then you saw certain states doing it probably better than other states. And also each state got to develop certain parts of a COVID policy. And I guess the most notable part of that in the recent era has been what to do with senior citizens in nursing homes who have COVID. So sometimes these shared responsibilities seem to work well. Sometimes people think, no, the federal government should take on some of this responsibility. In that era, the era that the Constitution was written, people were very leery of the federal government taking on any power. And nobody thought there were too many responsibilities of the federal government except the big 3 to protect life, liberty, and property, which, the more you think about that, that could be pretty much anything, couldn't it? So Federalism is shared power between the state and federal government. So each entity, has their own ability to control certain things. There's also a division of power, which leads to checks and balances within the federal branch of the government. So instead of just having a legislature, they decided to add the judicial branch and the executive branch. So you end up with a government that has three branches, three. I'm trying to show all three of my fingers so you don't think I'm flipping you off or something. So the branches are the legislature, which that's what the only one they had during the articles. So those are the folks who make the law. The executive branch, those are the folks who carry out the law. The head of the executive branch is the president, And they also had a lot of discussion about how to elect the president, how many presidents there would be. When they first started the discussion, they thought there might be 7, then they went to 3, and then they decided 1. And the vice president would be the runner-up in the presidential election. And they keep that for a couple of elections, and then they scrap it after Jefferson and Adams have a big fight or 2, or 25 years worth of big fights. That's really what they had. Those guys were so mad at each other, they really didn't speak to each other for 5 years. Can you imagine? You've ever been that mad at anybody? I think I had relatives I probably didn't speak to for about 15. I know it's too long, but I also lived several states away, so it's probably okay. All right. Separation of powers, sorry. And so you have the division of powers and the checks and balances. Did I mention judiciary? They created a judicial branch, but if you read the Constitution, which you might as well, it's pretty short. The article that deals with the judiciary just says we're going to have a judiciary and we'll set it up later. Yeah, so they knew they were going to create a system of courts and that the Congress would work to set that up later. So this is a sign really that these guys trusted each other quite a bit more than politicians trust each other now. It's my impression. I could be right. I could be wrong. All right. Checks and balances. The different branches of the government have different obligations, and those obligations cross over sometimes. So the legislative branch makes the laws, but the executive branch, the head of the executive branch, of course, the president, will decide if those laws that are created will turn into law. And if he doesn't sign them, then the legislative branch can override his veto. It's hard to do, doesn't happen very often, but it would take a 2/3 vote. The president can appoint advisors, but they have to be approved by the Senate. The president can sign a law that the legislature made, but then the judiciary branch can decide whether it's being enforced properly or whether the law is constitutional or not. That comes up a little bit later, but they decide that fairly quickly, historically. So each branch has the ability to limit the power of one of the other branches. And that's on purpose because their concern always is that the federal government will be too strong. Why we intentionally created that weak government under the Articles, and why the Constitution, while much stronger on the federal level, still is quite limited. Okay. And then you have groups of people who are either in favor of or opposed to the Constitution. The people who are in favor of the Constitution are referred to as Federalist or Nationalist. So they want people to start to think of the federal government or the nation as the root of their citizenship, like you're a citizen of the United States rather than a citizen of Texas. I know that's a tricky one because we love Texas and we are all citizens of Texas, of course, but perhaps more importantly, we're citizens of the United States. I don't know, that's a risky thing to say in Texas. It's easier if you're from Oklahoma, right? It's like, I'm from Oklahoma, but thank God I'm part of the United States as well, because you don't just want to be from Oklahoma. Yeah. Texas, I know, we don't feel quite the same way about it. But they wanted people to have more loyalty to the federal government than they did to their state. And they wanted the federal government to have the ability to govern the states on the off chance that there were problems, and also to protect the states. The Anti-Federalists felt like the Constitution had gone too far. Had gone too far. So they opposed the ratification of the Constitution. So the easy stuff here is that the Federalist, nationalist groups, those folks favored the adoption or ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists thought it was too strong, too powerful, and they opposed ratification or adoption of the Constitution. Okay. If you're wondering, were there any important states that felt that way? There were a couple. Let's see, New York, that's an important one. Virginia and somebody else. Why do I not remember? I want to say it was South Carolina. Let me double check because I don't want to lie to you. Do I want to lie to you? No, I do not want to lie to you. All right, double checking. Oh, Massachusetts kind of had trouble with it as well. And Massachusetts, that's the John Adams state. Part of that was, there's a bunch of Quakers there, and same in Pennsylvania as well. And they're a little concerned, not only with the strength of the federal government, but they're distressed that they didn't end slavery. So, all right. But when New York says, I'm not going to sign it unless people listen to New York, because there's a lot of people there, and it's the financial center of the United States. So New York's objection is going to matter more than, say, Georgia's would or South Carolina, because there's more people in New York and it's more important financially. So when New York says we're not going to sign this unless we get a Bill of Rights, then there's fairly serious consideration to adding a Bill of Rights. Now, we're going to pause for a second. I'll stop the sharing for a sec. All right, and I'll look at your faces or your H or your picture or something, and I'm going to ask you this. Do you remember who wrote the Constitution? Do you remember? I know you weren't there. I wasn't either. I'm pretty old. Not that old. I'll give you multiple choice. Was it Jefferson? Was it Washington? Was it Madison? Okay, does anybody like, okay, we got some votes for 3. Does anybody like Washington for writing the Constitution? I know, everybody thinks he's just a general, he couldn't write. He didn't write a whole lot of his own stuff. So it's either Jefferson or Madison, right? So they both write important stuff. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He did not attend the Constitutional Convention because he was off doing French things. Yeah, looking for ice cream. I don't know, whatever he did in France. He was an ambassador to that region. And the guy who wrote it was Madison. Remember, he's like the little studious, nerdy guy. And he studied all the constitutions and stuff. So Madison, yeah, I know. He matters to me because I got a fellowship from the Madison Foundation to finish my fabulous study so I can be qualified to teach you. So yeah, no, Madison indirectly helped me get my master's degree. So good job, James Madison. All right. The reason I bring up Madison, because I know some of you are going like, this is the worst professor ever. She doesn't have any idea why she brings up Madison. Plus, she doesn't put the notes back up. She puts the questions back up. Worst professor ever. The reason I bring up Madison is he really doesn't think they need a Bill of Rights. He thinks the thing is perfection, as is. He doesn't think it's perfection, but he thinks it's pretty good. And here's his concern. It's probably the same concern some of you have right now. It isn't for sure, but if you add a Bill of Rights, if you start listing what rights you have, what happens if you leave one out? Do you get that right? Or do you have to list every possible conceivable right? His concern was, philosophically, if you leave one out, then they don't get that right. So he believed in the idea of negative liberty, the idea that if you don't list rights, then everybody has those rights. So the assumption is, without a list, you just have all the rights, unless the document specifically says you have all the rights except the right to, I don't know, steal your neighbor's Dr. Pepper, or, you know, whatever they might specifically list. Texas, we love Dr. Pepper. But other people say, look, if you don't have a list of your rights, they can't be protected. So since those other people, a lot of them lived in New York, they were going to have to write the Bill of Rights if New York is going to ratify the treaty. The treaty, the Constitution. You know what I'm trying to say. So Madison agrees to write the Bill of Rights, and he writes, yes, 11 amendments to the Constitution. And I know some of you are going like, nope, 10. Nope, 11. It's just they only take 10 of them. They'll add the 11th one later. It becomes the 27th Amendment, which I think is really weird. Like 200 years later, they go like, oh, remember that one Madison wrote? Let's add that one back. We like that. It's kind of weird. All right, and it's a pretty logical thing. It limits the 27th Amendment, which is also written by Madison, like the first 10, says that if Congress votes for a raise, they don't get it, the next Congress does. So, but Madison writes 11 amendments. The convention or the states approved 10 of them, the first 10, which are referred to as the Bill of Rights collectively. So if anyone were to ever ask you, maybe on Jeopardy or to check out at HEB, it's like, you can't have this eggs and toilet paper until you answer my question about the Constitution. That's the way HEB would work if it were up to me. What is the greatest contribution of the Anti-Federalists? You would say they insisted on the Bill of Rights and it was added. That's what you would say, probably. Oh, and the book also mentions the Federalist Papers. I forgot to mention that. I assume you're familiar with those, but this is a list of, not a list, a collection of essays written by 3 dudes: Alexander Hamilton, who we sing about in the modern era and perhaps dance occasionally about, James Madison. I say that like it's a question. It's James Madison, and John Jay. Hamilton writes most of them. Yeah, Jay writes the fewest, and Madison somewhere in the middle. But they're written under a pen name called Publius, and which means like a citizen or the public person. And it's essentially propaganda about why we need the Constitution. There are Anti-Federalist papers, but as you can imagine, they're not well organized because Anti-Federalists don't like central power. So they're probably worth reading, but they're harder to find, and they're certainly not collected. But the Federalist Papers were published in major newspapers of the time period and pretty well read and distributed throughout the different colonies. There's also kind of a fun map in your book in chapter 7 that shows you sections of the country where people were more and less likely to favor the Constitution. That's on 271, if you want to look at it. And you'll notice that the middle is more in favor of the Constitution and the South is less. And the North is kind of 50-50. All right. Bill of Rights, we talked about that. Oh, Bill of Rights. You don't need to know every amendment. Maybe your government class. You already took your government class, didn't you? Do you have to memorize the amendments for that? I don't know. To me, they kind of matter because there's not that many. But first 10 amendments. The first one, of course, is freedom of speech, press, petition, assembly, and religion. And we typically think that one's fairly important. In Texas, everyone knows the Second Amendment, so I don't even have to mention it. The Third Amendment is a protection against being forced to have the army live at your house. It's not really a thing in the modern era, but it was in the colonial era. 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are protections for you if you get arrested, charged with a crime, sued, that sort of thing. So they provide that you can't be arrested without a warrant or probable cause, that once you get arrested, they have to follow due process, can't be forced to testify against yourself, you can have a lawyer, you can call witnesses, you should have a trial of your peer by jury of your peers, and that's also true in a lawsuit. And if you happen to be guilty and you get convicted, those are two different things, then your punishment has to be reasonable. No cruel or unusual punishment, no excessive fines or bails. That gets us through Amendment 8. Amendment 9 has Madison written all over it. I know he wrote all of them, but Madison, again, nervous that if he leaves off a right that you don't get it. So the 9th Amendment essentially says, if I left out a right, you get that as well. Now, when you go to court, not that you're going to court, but when people go to court, nobody says, I'm claiming the 9th Amendment as my own, because it's so vague. But it's really more of a philosophical statement. Vague, did I say that well? I said kind of vague, but vague. And then the 10th Amendment, which is a favorite in Texas as well, says that if the Constitution doesn't specifically ascribe a power to the federal government, then that power belongs to the state government, the local government, or to the people, to the people. Our governors always like to talk about the 10th Amendment. It's like, that's a state power, that's a state obligation. The federal government can't do that sort of thing. So, all right. So who wrote it? We got that. That was Madison. Why? Because I guess why and was it necessary are almost the same questions. Why? To protect individual rights that the Anti-Federalists feared would be lost without the Bill of Rights. And was it necessary? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. You can decide that. Madison didn't really think it was. The Anti-Federalists did think it was. It was necessary if you were going to get a constitution, because New York wasn't going to agree to it without the Bill of Rights. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of a different thing as well. So that last question, was it necessary? It's kind of up to you, except we wouldn't have had the Constitution. It wouldn't have been ratified without it. So Bill of Rights happens after the Constitution is ratified. And I think Bill of Rights is 1791, I think so, is when it's finally added. I think I'm right about that. The reason I'm trying to remember is Thurgood Marshall, I'm sure your favorite Supreme Court justice, one of mine for sure, resigns from the Supreme Court to help celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, which is why I think it was 300. Really, no. When did he resign? Was it 91? It must have been, because Clarence Thomas has been there a long time. Clarence Thomas was his replacement. All right. Oh, somebody just came in. Good job. All right. Oh, I think they must have gotten kicked out. Okay. So I feel like we're kind of done talking about chapter 7, kind of, maybe, sort of, maybe. It's hard to say, but I don't want to go just yet because we still have 10 minutes. No, 8 minutes. I know. Some of you are going like, no, we could go. Don't be like that. Don't be rude. Okay. So weekly question, next weekly question. Oh my gosh, I opened the right one this time. Do you feel okay about weekly question number 7? I'm telling you, if you look on 264, 265 and go for a couple pages, there's lots of good stuff there that will help you. The next weekly question is about John Marshall and why he matters in U.S. history. And you've probably looked at the notes for the next chapter a little bit and you've thought, why did you ask that? It's like, because I don't think you'll pay attention if I didn't ask that. John Marshall is a Supreme Court justice. He's the Chief Justice, and he's the first one who stays for a while. When they first created the office of Supreme Court Justice, we didn't know what the Supreme Court was going to do, so they didn't do very much. They helped solve disputes between states, negotiate things between disputes between the United States and foreign countries. Maybe sometimes we'd send members of the Supreme Court to help negotiate and write treaties, probably not in that order, write and negotiate treaties. But yeah, they weren't that important until John Marshall's term in the Supreme Court. And he is appointed by people who wanted a stronger central government at the time where national sentiment is that the federal government was too strong. So they wanted a weaker federal government. So he's kind of a holdover from an old political philosophy. And he's going to stay for over 30 years. He'll be the first justice who stays for more than like 5 years, first Chief Justice. And he turns that into a really important office, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because he stayed and he made it powerful. But we'll talk more specifically about him next time. I don't want to get too much into him, but the next chapter is going to go over, it goes over a lot of stuff really fast or in not too much detail, I suppose. So you've got the presidencies too of George Washington, who's almost perfect as a leader. I know he's not almost perfect as a person because I know that it's really hard to judge people from this time period in their context, because you got to look at the first president and then like the third and then the fourth and the fifth, and you're going to go like, they're slave owners and they're proponents of liberty, and how does that work? Notice I left off the second. That's John Adams. He wasn't a slave owner. And yeah, I mean, they're problematic. They are. And the book, the chapter we just went over, 7, also talks about those guys and how, you know, what their thought was about slavery, but because they all thought slavery was wrong. They knew it was wrong, because how do you not know that owning a person is wrong? I think we all know that instinctively. They all had a lot of money invested in owning people. So the question is, are you willing to give up your financial security for the principles that you know are right? And the answer for them is not really. That was the answer for them, not really. Jefferson will write quite a bit about how he doesn't think that African Americans, he doesn't write in that with that term, of course, he doesn't think that freed slaves would be able to survive on their own financially, because people wouldn't hire them, they couldn't own property, that sort of thing. So rather than changing laws so they could own property, it's like, yeah, I don't want to sell my slaves because they'll be destitute. So he only freed a few slaves, and he only freed the ones that he thought could make a living when they didn't live on his plantation. Washington's a little different. He's going to free everybody, but not until his wife dies, because he married a rich woman with slaves. So they were technically, in his eyes, her slaves, which I know makes him a little different for the time period, because he thought that his wife had property rights, but then those property rights were owning people. So I know it's not, you can't just look at it and go like, that's really noble of him, because it's kind of a mixed thing there, isn't it? And then Madison was certain that slavery contradicted the ideas of freedom, but also was certain he didn't want to be poor. So these things, they're problematic, aren't they? But the next chapter talks about Washington's presidency, Adams, Jefferson, and I think it even slides into Madison, but I can't remember for sure. There's a bunch of stuff. And then the end of the chapter we just talked about, I'm sorry I didn't mention this because it is almost time to go. The end of the chapter also starts to talk about who can be a citizen and why they can't. So it talks about how people really limited citizenship to white men during that time period. And I know you're thinking, well, that's just really exclusive and racist, and you're correct. And it's also broader than probably any other Western European nation at that time period, because it could include poor white men. So For the time period, it's a fairly broad definition of citizenship. For, for our perspective, it's a very narrow one. So, all right. Before you guys go, because I know it's almost time, let me kind of see if you have any questions and then double check the roll, and I'll stop the